The clock on the office wall blinked 11:30 p.m. I rubbed my eyes, exhaustion clinging to me like a heavy blanket. I should have been out of here hours ago. My regular shift ended at 10 p.m., but tonight was different. A last-minute project had come in, and my boss had hovered over my shoulder, insisting I finish it before leaving. Now I was staring at my computer screen, squinting at the harsh glow as I rushed to add the final touches. I was cutting it close, praying I wouldn't miss the last subway home. I worked for a tech company nestled in the heart of the city. The job itself wasn't terrible. Mundane tasks, endless lines of code, reports to file. But these late nights were starting to take their toll. The darkened cubicles around me felt more like the confines of a prison cell than an office. I lived on the outskirts, a good hour away by subway, and missing the last train meant either crashing on the office couch or shelling out money for a taxi that I could barely afford. Neither option seemed appealing. "All right, done," I muttered to myself, clicking the save button. Relief washed over me as I finally stood up, stretching my arms above my head. My shoulders ached and my back protested as I moved. I quickly grabbed my jacket from the back of the chair and threw it over my shoulders. The room was silent except for the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. The silence was almost suffocating, a reminder of how isolated this building felt at this hour. I shivered and turned off my computer, making my way to the door. I checked my phone for the time, 11:50 p.m. I had 10 minutes to make it to the station. My heart sank as I realized how tight the timing was. "Come on, you can make it," I muttered under my breath, picking up my pace. My footsteps echoed loudly in the empty hallway, each step a reminder of how alone I was. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering occasionally, casting long shadows on the floor. It was unsettling how quiet it was. I exited the building, stepping out into the crisp night air. The city felt different at this hour. It wasn't just quiet, it was unnervingly still. I glanced up at the sky, the stars barely visible against the haze of city lights. The usual bustle of the streets was gone, replaced by an eerie calm that made my skin prickle. The streetlights glowed orange, casting distorted shadows that stretched across the pavement like clawed fingers. For a moment, I stood there feeling an inexplicable sense of dread. I shook it off. I didn't have time for this. I needed to catch that train. I broke into a jog, my shoes slapping against the pavement. The sound echoed off the surrounding buildings, each footfall magnifying the emptiness of the city around me. As I turned the corner, I glanced over my shoulder. It was a reflex, a fleeting sense that something was out there, watching me. But when I looked back, there was nothing, just the empty street and the shadows cast by the lampposts. "Get a grip," I muttered, scolding myself for letting my imagination run wild. It was just the fatigue, the long hours catching up with me. Or at least, that's what I tried to convince myself. I focused on the road ahead and quickened my pace, feeling my heartbeat thudding in my chest. I reached the subway station and took the steps two at a time, the echoes of my hurried steps bouncing off the grimy walls. The subway station had always felt a bit grim, but tonight it seemed worse. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered sporadically, casting the platform in a sickly yellow hue. A stale, metallic odor hung in the air, mixing with the faint scent of mold. I glanced up at the large clock mounted on the wall. Midnight. I cursed under my breath. I had missed the last subway. But then, a glimmer of hope flickered inside me. Subways were often late. Maybe I still had a chance. I scanned the platform, hoping for some sign that the train might arrive. The station was deserted, not a soul in sight. The benches were empty, and even the usual stray cats that roamed around were nowhere to be seen. The silence was oppressive, weighing heavily on my chest. I wrapped my jacket tighter around myself, trying to ward off the sudden chill that crept up my spine. I paced back and forth along the platform, the sound of my footsteps echoing unnaturally loudly. There was no breeze, no hum of an approaching train, just the static crackling of the overhead speakers, occasionally interrupted by a distant drip of water from the ceiling. I glanced down the tunnel, peering into the darkness. It stretched endlessly, a black void that seemed to swallow the faint light at its edges. Then, I noticed something, or rather someone. Standing at the far end of the platform was a figure. My breath caught in my throat as I squinted, trying to make out the details. The man was tall, wearing a black suit that looked strangely outdated, like something from an old noir film. His head was slightly bowed, obscured by a wide-brimmed fedora. I couldn't see his eyes, but his mouth. I could see a faint smile stretching across his face. It was too wide, frozen in place, almost painted on. My stomach twisted into knots. Who was he, and what was he doing here at this hour? The longer I looked at him, the more unsettling he became. He stood there, unnaturally still, as if carved out of stone. An inexplicable fear clawed at my insides, telling me to look away, to leave. I tried to move my feet, to turn back toward the stairs, but I was rooted to the spot. I felt like a mouse caught in the gaze of a snake. A loud screeching noise suddenly shattered the silence, causing me to jump. My eyes snapped toward the tunnel as a subway train came barreling out of the darkness, its headlights piercing the void like two blazing eyes. It screeched to a halt in front of me, the sound grating against my nerves. The doors slid open with a mechanical hiss, an invitation to step inside. I glanced back toward where the man had been standing. The platform was now empty. He was gone. My heart pounded in my chest. Had I imagined him? Was my mind playing tricks on me? I didn't know, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. Must be seeing things, I muttered to myself, forcing a shaky laugh. I hurried inside the subway car, grateful to escape the oppressive stillness of the platform. I found a seat near the middle of the carriage and slumped into it, trying to calm my racing heart. The doors closed with a loud clunk, and the train jolted forward, plunging back into the darkness of the tunnel. As I settled into my seat, I took a deep breath, staring at the floor. I would make it home after all, or so I thought. The subway carriage hummed as it picked up speed, gliding through the dark tunnels beneath the city. I let out a shaky breath, leaning back in my seat. My eyes darted around, taking in my surroundings. Something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but the air was thick, suffocating. It clung to me like a cold, wet blanket. There were a few passengers scattered throughout the car, but they weren't the usual faces I saw on my rides home. Each of them sat unnaturally still, alone in their little pockets of isolation. A shiver crawled down my spine. I tried to dismiss it as nothing more than my imagination, fueled by exhaustion and a long day's work. Yet, the feeling of unease only grew stronger. Directly across from me sat an elderly woman in a worn, moth-eaten coat. Her skin was pale, almost sickly, with dark shadows under her eyes. She stared straight ahead, unblinking, her hands resting on her lap, fingers gnarled with age. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, but her eyes were what caught my attention. They were unnervingly wide, as if fixed on something only she could see. There was a shine to them, a wet glisten that looked like the beginning of tears. Further down the carriage sat a man in a gray hoodie, his face obscured by the shadows of his hood. I couldn't make out his features, but I could feel his gaze on me, burning into my skin. Every time I glanced in his direction, he tilted his head slightly, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. I looked away quickly, my heart pounding. His presence filled me with an inexplicable sense of dread. In the corner, closest to the door, was a child. No older than 10, he sat with his legs dangling off the seat, swinging back and forth with an eerie rhythm. His eyes were cast downward, fixed on the floor, and he muttered to himself. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but his lips moved rapidly, his voice an unintelligible murmur. His skin was pallid, almost translucent, as if he hadn't seen sunlight in years. There was something wrong about him, something that made my instincts scream to stay away. I shifted in my seat, my anxiety growing with each passing second. Who were these people? Why did they look so strange? My stomach twisted, a growing knot of fear settling deep within me. I glanced around, hoping to spot some other passengers, anyone, that might seem normal. But it was just us, 5 strangers in the dimly lit subway car. Then I noticed something else. They were all looking at me. The old woman, the hooded man, the child. Each of them had turned their heads, their eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The elderly woman's gaze was unblinking, her eyes glistening like 2 dark marbles. The man in the hoodie tilted his head even further, the angle unnatural, his hood slipping back slightly to reveal a sliver of pale skin. The child had stopped muttering, his mouth now open in a silent scream. "What the?" I muttered under my breath, shrinking into my seat. This had to be a dream, some kind of nightmare brought on by stress and exhaustion. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing the scene to change when I opened them again. But it didn't. "Hey!" a voice hissed from my left. I jumped, my heart nearly leaping out of my chest. I turned sharply to see a man sitting 2 seats away. He was dressed in a rumpled suit, his hair disheveled, eyes wide and bloodshot. He leaned toward me, his face etched with an expression of wild desperation. "What?" I managed to croak out, my throat dry and tight. "You shouldn't be on this train," he whispered urgently, his eyes darting around the carriage as if afraid of being overheard. "It won't take you where you want to go." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice shaky, barely keeping the fear at bay. His gaze locked onto mine, and I saw the depth of his fear reflected in his eyes. "This train doesn't go to the outskirts," he muttered. "It goes somewhere else." Before I could respond, the train began to slow, the lights flickering overhead, casting warped shadows across the faces of the other passengers. The air grew colder, and I felt my skin prickle with goosebumps. We were approaching the first station. My heart hammered in my chest, every beat echoing in my ears. As the train came to a halt, the doors slid open with a soft hiss. I peered out, my breath catching in my throat. The platform was dimly lit, shrouded in a pale, sickly yellow light that seemed to wash everything out. A group of people stood scattered across the platform, motionless, facing the train. My eyes darted from one face to another. Each person wore a different expression. Some were grinning eerily, others had lips twisted into grotesque frowns. But they all had one thing in common: their eyes, wide, unblinking, fixed on me. A wave of nausea surged through me. The way they stared, it wasn't normal. It felt like they were expecting something, waiting for me to make a move. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get off the train and find another way home. I took a step toward the door, feeling the pull of the open platform, the chance to escape this nightmare. "Don't," the man in the rumpled suit hissed beside me. "Don't get off." I froze, looking back at him. "Why not?" I whispered, the words barely escaping my dry throat. "Because they're not alive," he replied, his voice trembling. "They're just reflections." I didn't understand what he meant, but a cold dread settled over me. The people on the platform began to move, their heads turning in unison, tracking my every motion. Their movements were slow, deliberate, like puppets controlled by invisible strings. I staggered back, my legs weak, bumping into the seat behind me. The train doors closed with a resounding thud, sealing me inside. As the train lurched forward, a burst of laughter filled the carriage, echoing off the metal walls. I spun around to see the man in the rumpled suit staring at me, his eyes glinting with a sinister light. "I told you," he said, his voice dripping with amusement. "You can't leave." The train surged into the darkness of the tunnel, the overhead lights flickering erratically as it picked up speed. I felt like I was being swallowed whole, trapped in some endless ride through the bowels of the city. I slumped back in my seat, my heart hammering against my ribcage. What had I just witnessed? The figures on the platform, the laughter that echoed after the doors closed. This was beyond a mere bad dream. It was as if reality had bent around me, trapping me in a twisted game I didn't understand. I glanced around the carriage, my eyes sweeping over the other passengers. They had all returned to their eerie stillness, staring blankly into the void or at the floor beneath their feet. It was as if the moment of terror had never happened. The old woman sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap. The man in the hoodie stared at his own shoes, and the child by the door resumed his eerie muttering. It was like they had slipped back into some trance, a false calmness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I rubbed my eyes, hoping to clear the creeping fear. Perhaps this was some elaborate prank, or maybe I had lost my grip on reality after all. The work, the stress, the sleepless nights, it was catching up with me. That had to be it. I just needed to get off this train and everything would return to normal. Minutes passed, or perhaps it was hours. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that dimly lit carriage. The air was growing colder, my breath coming out in faint wisps. I shivered, pulling my jacket closer around me. Suddenly, the train began to slow, a dreadful anticipation building in my chest. The lights flickered above, casting warped shadows on the metal walls as we approached the next station. The train screeched to a halt, and the doors slid open with a whisper. I hesitated, glancing out onto the platform, squinting to make sense of what I was seeing. This station was different from the last. The walls were lined with mirrors, dozens of them, stretching as far as I could see. Each one was covered in grime, cracked, reflecting the platform in warped and distorted ways. The light on the platform was dim, casting a faint glow that made the reflections in the mirrors look even more grotesque. I stared, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. At first, the mirrors seemed to reflect only the empty platform, but then shapes began to emerge in their murky depths. Shadowy figures moved behind the glass, growing larger, their forms twisting as they crept closer to the surface. Their faces were obscured, hidden behind veils of darkness, yet I could feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting. "What the hell?" I whispered, taking a step back into the safety of the carriage. The mirrors began to crack, thin fractures spidering out across the glass with a sound like bones snapping. My reflection in the nearest mirror started to change, warping into something unrecognizable. My face twisted, my eyes stretching unnaturally wide, my mouth elongating into a jagged, manic smile that threatened to split my face in two. I staggered backward, my heart pounding in my chest. The shadows in the mirrors pressed their hands against the glass, their distorted limbs bending in impossible ways as if trying to break free. A faint whisper filled the air, growing louder, enveloping the station in an eerie cacophony of voices. "Don't look!" the man in the rumpled suit called out from behind me, his voice sharp and urgent. "If you look, they'll come for you." I tore my gaze away, shutting my eyes tight, feeling the cold sweat trickle down my neck. My hands gripped the metal pole beside me as if it were a lifeline. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me, mocking, taunting. I wanted to run, to scream, but I was paralyzed by fear. The train doors slid shut, and the sound of cracking mirrors was drowned out by the train's acceleration. I opened my eyes cautiously, the mirrors now disappearing from view as we plunged back into the dark tunnel. My reflection on the train window caught my eye for a split second. It looked back at me with that same twisted, impossible smile. I blinked, and it was gone, replaced by my own pale, terrified face. "What the hell is happening?" I muttered, slumping into my seat. I buried my face in my hands, trying to make sense of the nightmare that was unfolding around me. I had to find a way off this train, but every instinct screamed at me to stay put. Something out there wanted me to leave, and I wasn't sure if I could survive what awaited on those platforms. Where is this train going?" I stammered, looking over at the man in the rumpled suit. He was sitting across from me, his gaze fixed on the floor, his expression somber. "It's going nowhere," he replied softly. "It just rides the tracks, picking up lost souls. Once you're on, you can't get off." I shook my head, refusing to accept his words. "No, there has to be a way out," I insisted, my voice trembling. "There has to be." The man's eyes lifted to meet mine, and I saw something in them, pity perhaps. "Maybe there is," he said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. "But no one has ever found it." The train surged forward, plunging deeper into the darkness. The rhythmic clanking of the tracks below was the only sound that filled the carriage. I could feel every muscle in my body tensed, ready to spring into action. My mind raced with the man's words. "It's going nowhere. Once you're on, you can't get off." It was absurd, but nothing that had happened so far made any sense. The eerie passengers, the twisted reflections, the oppressive darkness, all of it felt like I had fallen into a waking nightmare. Time stretched on. Minutes felt like hours, and the cold air in the carriage wrapped around me like a shroud. My breath came out in shallow gasps, visible in the faint light from the overhead bulbs. I glanced at the other passengers, hoping for some sign that they were just as unnerved as I was. But they remained still, their eyes vacant, like mannequins propped up in their seats. The train began to slow again, and dread coiled in my stomach. Another station, another ordeal. I didn't know how much more of this I could take. The lights flickered, casting strange, contorted shadows on the walls as the train eased into a halt. My heart skipped a beat when the doors opened with a whisper, revealing the platform outside. This time the air was thick with fog, swirling in the dim yellow glow of the station's overhead lights. I squinted, trying to make out any shapes within the mist. And then I saw them, copies of myself. At least a dozen of them stood scattered across the platform. My chest tightened as I took in the sight. They were identical to me, yet not quite right. Their faces were twisted into expressions of malice, their eyes hollow and empty. They stood silently, each with their gaze fixed on me, staring through the fog with a terrifying intensity. "No, no, this can't be real," I whispered, taking a step back. My legs felt like jelly, threatening to give out beneath me. The figures moved in response, stepping forward as if pulled by invisible strings. Their mouths opened in unison, and a wave of whispers washed over me, my own voice twisted and distorted. "Maybe you should have stayed at the office. You don't belong here." The whispers grew louder, overlapping, filling the carriage with a cacophony of my own words. They echoed the things I had said earlier that day, during work, during my frantic rush to the station. The mocking tone in their voices was like nails on a chalkboard, grating against my sanity. "Shut up!" I screamed, pressing my hands to my ears, trying to block out the sound. The figures didn't stop. They continued to whisper, their faces stretching into grotesque smiles that made my skin crawl. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. The man in the rumpled suit appeared beside me, his expression grim. "Don't listen to them," he said sharply, gripping my arm. "They're just imitations, reflections of your own fears." I looked at him, panic twisting my thoughts. Why are they here? What do they want? He shook his head. "They're part of the train. It's showing you what you refuse to face." The whispers suddenly stopped, the platform falling silent, as if a switch had been flipped. The figures remained motionless, their mouths hanging open in a silent scream. My pulse thundered in my ears. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. "Get back inside, now." I staggered backward, stumbling into the carriage just as the door slid shut with a mechanical click. The figures on the platform remained frozen in place, their hollow eyes watching me as the train pulled away. I sank into my seat, feeling the blood drain from my face. The train jolted forward again, picking up speed as it descended into the darkness. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. I slumped back into my seat, hands trembling. I tried to steady my breathing, but the air felt heavy, like I was inhaling pure dread. I glanced around the carriage. The passengers stared ahead blankly, their expressions indifferent to the terror that gripped me. The man in the rumpled suit sat a few seats away, his eyes fixed on me, a thin smile spreading across his face. But there was someone else now, a new presence. My stomach churned as I caught sight of a figure standing at the far end of the carriage. It was him, the man from the platform, the one with the black suit, fedora, and that unsettling smile. He was standing near the doors, his head tilted downward, obscuring his face. His presence was like a void, a patch of darkness that swallowed up the light around it. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt dry, locked by fear. The train began to slow, signaling another stop. I glanced out the window, but the platform outside was nothing but a swirl of black shadows, a void that seemed to stretch infinitely. The train screeched to a halt, and the doors slid open with a mechanical hiss. The man in the suit stepped forward, his polished shoes clacking softly against the train's metal floor. He moved slowly, deliberately, each step echoing in the silence of the carriage. My heart skipped a beat as he came closer. He stopped a few feet away from me, his head still tilted downward, obscuring his eyes. I could see the corner of his mouth curl into that same eerie smile. He finally spoke, his voice smooth and unnervingly calm. "Did you enjoy the ride?" His tone almost mocking. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "Who are you?" I managed to croak out, my voice barely above a whisper. He let out a low chuckle, his shoulders shaking slightly. "Who I am is not important," he said. "But what I want? Now that's an interesting question." He slowly raised his head, and for the first time, I saw his eyes. They were hollow, dark voids that seemed to stretch into infinity, pulling me in, drowning me in a sea of nothingness. I tore my gaze away, feeling nauseated. "You've been trying to escape," he continued, his voice like a velvet whisper that scratched at the edge of my sanity. "But there's nowhere to go. This train isn't just a ride, it's a journey inward." I blinked, trying to comprehend his words. He leaned in closer, the brim of his fedora casting a shadow over his face. "This train," he said softly, "is a reflection of your fears, your regrets. It's why you see those people on the platforms, why the mirrors distort your image. It's all a part of you." I shook my head, backing away in my seat. No, this is some kind of nightmare. I'll wake up. I have to wake up." He straightened up, his smile widening. "You already are awake," he said almost sympathetically, "and there's only one way this ride ends." I felt a surge of panic. "What do you mean? How does it end?" The man in the suit tilted his head, studying me with his empty eyes. "It ends when you make a choice," he replied. "You either embrace the shadows, let them consume you, or you face them." I glanced toward the open doors, the platform outside now a swirling vortex of darkness. Was that what he meant by facing them, stepping out into that abyss? My legs felt like lead. I couldn't move even if I wanted to. "You're not ready," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper now. "Not yet." The train jolted forward suddenly, the doors snapping shut. The man in the suit stepped back, his form melting into the darkness at the far end of the carriage. The other passengers resumed their eerie stillness, as if the encounter had never happened. I slumped back in my seat, gasping for breath. My mind swirled with confusion and fear. What was I supposed to do? What choice was he talking about? The train began to slow once more, and my heart sank. Another stop. Another horror. I gripped the seat, bracing myself for whatever awaited me this time. I had to be ready. I couldn't keep running. The train halted with a jarring screech, the lights above flickering as the doors slid open. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling as I peered out. The platform was empty, utterly and completely empty. No fog, no mirrors, no twisted figures, just a vast expanse of shadowy concrete that seemed to stretch endlessly. I hesitated, my pulse thudding in my ears. Was this another trick? Another nightmare? I stepped forward, feeling the cold air from the platform brush against my face. It was different this time, almost inviting in its stillness. The man in the rumpled suit stood behind me, his eyes fixed on the darkness outside. "This is your stop," he said quietly. I turned to face him, confusion and fear twisting inside me. "But what's out there?" He met my gaze, his expression unreadable. "That's for you to find out," he replied. "Or you can stay here, keep riding in circles." I looked out at the platform, the vast emptiness calling to me. My instinct screamed at me to stay on the train, to retreat into the safety of its confines. But wasn't that what I had been doing all along? Running, hiding, refusing to face what terrified me? I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of my fear pressing down on my shoulders. "Will I come back?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The man's expression softened, his eyes gleaming with a hint of something, pity, perhaps, or hope. "That's up to you," he said. I nodded, turning to the open door. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in the stillness. I stepped forward, crossing the threshold and into the darkness. The air around me grew cold, thick, almost suffocating. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for whatever was to come. For a moment there was nothing, just an endless void pressing in from every direction. I felt weightless, suspended in an abyss that swallowed all sound. A faint whisper broke through the silence, growing louder, its words unintelligible but familiar. My eyes flew open. I found myself standing back on the empty platform. The train was gone. The oppressive atmosphere lifted like a veil, leaving only the faint sound of the wind whistling through the tunnel. I glanced around, half expecting the twisted figures, the shadows, the mirrors, but there was nothing. Just an empty platform, drenched in darkness. I let out a shaky breath, the tightness in my chest loosening slightly. Relief washed over me. I took a step forward, my foot scuffing against the worn concrete. And that's when I realized it was the same platform where I'd started. The same grimy tiles, the same cracked clock hanging crookedly on the wall. My heart sank, confusion swirling in my mind. I turned to the far end of the platform, where the shadows were thickest. That's when I saw him, the man in the suit. He was standing just at the edge of the light, his face partially obscured by the brim of his fedora, his mouth stretched into that unnerving smile, eyes glinting with an emotion I couldn't quite place. Amusement, pity, or something far darker. "Did you really think you'd left?" he whispered, his voice carrying through the air as if it were a breeze. "This journey isn't one you can walk away from." I stared at him, my mind racing to make sense of his words. The darkness around him seemed to pulse and shift, like shadows squirming beneath the surface. Then, in a moment that defied logic, his form began to dissipate, unraveling into wisps of smoke that danced at the edges of the platform. "No," I muttered, taking a step back. "This can't be real. You're not real." But the smile remained, even as his body faded. It hung in the air, a crescent of white teeth suspended in the gloom. "You'll be back," the smile seemed to say, though his lips no longer moved. "You'll ride the train again, and when you do, remember, this is all inside you." The words echoed in my mind, circling like a mantra. I watched as the man's form, his hat, his suit, that eerie smile, swirled into a final dark wisp, dissipating into the wind. The platform was empty again, but the chill lingered. I turned slowly, looking around at the deserted station. My heart pounded against my ribs as reality bent and twisted. Was I truly free, or had I never really left the ride? In the distance, a faint sound reached my ears, a rumble, like the approach of a train. "No," I whispered, stepping back. My legs felt like lead. I turned toward the stairs leading out of the station, forcing one foot in front of the other. I had to leave, had to get out before the cycle could start again. As I ascended, the tunnel behind me grew quieter, the sound of the train fading into nothingness. But in the back of my mind, that smile lingered, a reminder that some journeys don't end, they merely loop. And somewhere, deep in the shadows of the station, I knew the man in the suit was still waiting for the next ride.